The last one that I gave here, or last one I gave was a while ago. Yeah, 6 months ago, more maybe. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks y'all for having me. And we were just saying here, this is a pretty one of a kind space. Like the accumulation of stuff and knowledge and artifacts on the walls over a very long period of time is really, really something special. So shout out to the folks who've kept this place alive as long as they have, and to going to steward it into its next chapter here. But yeah, thanks y'all for having me here and letting me ramble a little bit. What I'm going to talk about is, I think, the thing that I'm going to spend the most of my career thinking about. It's something I've been thinking about for the last 4 years, ever since I started working full time on cryptocurrency related things. And it's the idea of, what do we own on the internet? What can you own on the internet? How can you own things on the internet? And how should we structure ownership on the internet? What's the ideal? And the kind of way that I've been thinking about it is like, what is the property rights layer of the internet? What does it exist like now? How does it exist in the kind of world that we all tinker in, which is the cryptocurrency world? And how can it exist beyond that, beyond both? I'm Jaden. I work with Benny and these folks here at Future Primitive. We've been building weird experimental crypto products for the last 4 years. You might have seen us from such hits as giving every NFT a wallet with ERC 6551, putting NFT minting photo booths all over the place. You'll probably see some of those in the city as a way to onboard people to crypto. Weird bead lizards, as you saw earlier. We've done a lot of weird stuff, and experimenting with the medium of what can you do when you own things on the internet. So yeah, that's Future Primitive. That's been us. But what do you really own? I think the thing that's most interesting to me is, like, I realize that not a lot of people agree with me with what I mean when I say ownership. Oftentimes I'll be like, yeah, like owning things on the internet, and I'll kind of have one thing in my head about what I assume that means. And then over the course of the conversation, the person I'm talking to, it'll become pretty clear that we have different understandings of what it means to own something. And so I think that exploring this idea is really interesting, and especially applied to the things that we use every day on the internet, right? We use things on the internet that feel like ours, right? If you host a website, your domain name feels like you own it. If you use an email address, it feels like yours. It's one of those kind of core things of your identity on the internet. Social accounts, bank accounts, money, and with this new wave of AI tools, things that feel like they're yours. At the very least, you use them all the time. What does your ownership look like over that? And then in the world that we inhabit of cryptocurrency, and specifically for me, having worked on Ethereum in that ecosystem for the last number of years, what does it look like to own things on Ethereum, both at the asset layer, so owning currencies themselves, but I think more interestingly at the account layer? What does it look like to own things? And I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on any of this by any means. This is just me riffing and jamming, so don't take anything that I say here with more than its due grain of salt. But when I think about owning things on the internet, this is what I think about. And this is kind of the definition that's become more clear to me as to what ownership really is. It's the idea that there's some enforcement of exclusive and perpetual usage rights and transfer rights over something. And that's kind of long and complicated, but I think this is kind of like is each of the component pieces of what it means to own something. The enforcement layer is like, who makes sure that you really own that thing, right? Who guarantees it? Who makes it such that ownership is possible? Or what, in the case of things that are not humans. Exclusive is like, who gets to claim the rights of ownership? Who gets to say they are an owner? And in what cases is that true and not true? Perpetual, like, do your rights of ownership and usage and transfer, do those stay the same over time? Or do they change? Are they subject to the kind of varying ways of the future? And then how do you actually use this thing, right? There's this thing you own. If you own it, what rights do you have to use it? And how are those given to you? And can those rights be exchanged with someone else? I think to some degree, these are all variables of ownership, different characteristics that have like different levels on the spectrum of how much you own something. And I've always been really curious about the way that this actually exists on the internet now. So I did what most people don't do, and I read through all the terms of service, or at the very least had some artificial help in summarizing them. And I think it's kind of interesting to apply this framework of ownership to the things that we interact with every day, and to see, like, to what level do we actually own the things we use on the internet in kind of the normal Web 2 accounts that we use every day, and then how do the things that we use inside of the crypto tinkering world, how do those match up? Have we really solved the problem once and for all and like finally got here? Or are there still things that we can do? Are there still ways that we can play with these variables to optimize them? To start with domain names, domain names are actually one of the more interesting things you can own on the internet, or own in quotation marks, because they have a lot of these properties, even though they don't have all of them. They have this kind of central registrar called ICANN, and then they delegate permissions to domain registrars like your Namecheaps and your GoDaddys and your kind of the companies that we interact with, and then servers that you can run on the internet that actually determine where that domain points. Like that's actually a pretty decent architecture for this. Do you have exclusive rights to your domain name? Mostly, right? You can set the records, but they can be suspended. And interestingly, they can be suspended for some really weird reasons. For example, if you don't update your contact details within 15 days of your registrar reaching out to you and asking you to update your contact details, they have the right to suspend your domain and do what they will with it. That's kind of that seems pretty significant when it comes to representing ownership. And they're not perpetual, right? You pay for it year over year. There's a fixed term to it. You can extend that. It's not perpetual. But you do get usage rights. You get to update your records. You get to point that website, that domain, to whatever website you want. And you can point it to whatever name servers you want. You can use it for email and all sorts of protocols. That's pretty great. And you do have transfer rights. Built into the way that ICANN manages this, if you register a domain with the registrar, you have the right to receive an auth code, which is a code that authorizes you to transfer control of that domain to someone else. And I think, as we'll see here, transfer rights are actually pretty rare. Being able to transfer an account of yours or an asset of yours is actually pretty rare across a lot of the accounts we use day to day. And the next level is email addresses. These are kind of like the core of our everyday experience on the internet. You sign into 1 million accounts with an email address. If we take a look at something like Gmail, who enforces that you own that email account? Well, it's Gmail. They run the servers. They decide. And your right over that email address is not really guaranteed. If you are failing to comply with their terms of service, or you're doing something that's outside of their way that they want you to use an account, they can terminate your email account, just kick you off of it. And they also have a license to your content. So all of your emails, they are licensed to do certain things with, to provide services. And interestingly, your accounts, if you don't log into your Gmail account for 2 years, they have a right to delete your data without telling you. And their terms of service is like, if you don't use your account for 2 years, you're fully inactive, we can just delete your account. And you do have rights to usage, right? You do have the ability to use that email and send it, but it is subject to filtering. You can't send spam or malware, and they have these automated filtering systems in place. If they think you're sending spam or malware, if you ever tried to upload a big .exe file and send it over Gmail, you realize pretty quickly there are some things you can and can't send. And as is with a lot of internet accounts, you have no right to transfer your account. You can't transfer your account from one person to another. You can give them the password, but from like Google's perspective of rights on the internet, you have no right to do that, to transfer your account to somebody else. It's against their terms of service. Social accounts are even more restrictive, I think, than email. And there's basically unilateral control by the platform of what you own of the account. And the platform owns the account itself. They can revoke it at any time. And the username, which is kind of like analogous to an email or a domain, is not even really treated as an asset itself by the account. It's more about metadata on your account that they can change at will. So you have no ownership at all over usernames. Even X, which is selling usernames for a very large amount in their terms of service, says that they still hold the right to revoke those at any point. And they can terminate your account at will. It's a pretty common stipulation across all of these terms of services. You do have the right to use it, but it's a limited license for as long as they would like to give you the ability to use their service. At any point, they can revoke that license to use their app, and you would lose access to your. And again, transfer rights are prohibited, so you can't transfer your account, even though you can send a password to someone. From the perspective of the Instagrams and the Twitters of the world, if you do that, you're outside of the terms of service. A bit of out of order, but bank accounts are a really interesting one. You would think that like the money you own in your bank account is probably the closest thing you have to actual ownership of like something on the internet, right? Like it's your money, it's your bank account. Like that ought to be about as close as you can get to owning something on. And there is some good enforcement for this, right? You have the legal system at your disposal. There's deposit insurance companies, FDIC, CDIC in Canada, that will guarantee access to a certain amount of capital in an account. But you don't really own the balance. According to the terms, once you put a balance in a bank account, the bank owns it. And they can do what they will with it. What you own is a repayment claim. So you own a right that the bank has to give you your money back at some point, subject to some terms. Those terms are adjustable a little bit, and there are limits in place on those terms. For example, in Canada, in a major bank account that I looked at the terms of service of, if your account isn't active for 10 years, the assets are forfeit to the Bank of Canada. And so if you don't use the account at all, then you are subject to losing it. Similarly, usage rights, you can transfer and withdraw, and this is about as close as you can get to like really using something you own on the internet, but there are limits, right? There's limits to what you can transfer in the interface. If you go and try and withdraw $1 million, there will be questions and procedures you have to follow that are enforced. And there's also a really interesting point on transfer rights. Most terms of service for bank accounts prevent what's called a security interest. So you can only borrow against that money or like promise somebody that money in return for some loan with the bank that you're doing business with. Anyone else, you have to ask the bank's permission. There's just really interesting things. And this little tidbit in famous Bank of Canada's thing, any information you provide to bank shall become the sole property of bank and may be used freely by the bank. It's interesting how much the accounts that we use on a daily basis have these restrictions that we don't really run into on a daily basis, but are still there, kind of dormant, waiting to be realized. I think AI tools are one of the more interesting things. We've now got this class of tool where we can create anything, generate anything. Who owns these things you generate? Do you own it? Or do you own the data you're putting there? Do you own your account? Do you own a right to continue using inference from this company? And the answer is maybe kind of in an ideal scenario, but edge cases abound as always. The platform owns your account, can revoke it at any point, pretty standard for most internet accounts. If you don't log into your account for 1 year, your account could expire. They can delete your data without worries. And revoke access to your account. API credits also expire. So if you buy a bunch of API credits, don't use them, they expire after about a year. You're also limited in your usage. A lot of these providers will refuse to do anything that touches IP in any way. If you're doing any kind of, if you generate something with Mickey Mouse, maybe Mickey Mouse is a bad example as public domain, but with a copyrighted character, they're quite happy to say, sorry, we're not going to let you do that. Another one that's really interesting is distillation. This is something that you'll see a lot of the open models from over in Asia doing, which will basically take all the outputs of like a bunch of ChatGPT sessions and use that to train a new model that's almost as good as the model they were distilling from. And most of the model providers, the big ones, specifically say that you can't do that. You can't take your chat logs from the model and use it to train your own model that's better or almost as good as our model. It's an interesting limit on usage. And again, you can't transfer your account. And so this is, as you would kind of expect, right? As you would expect a lot of these Web 2 companies that are more there to try and build businesses, less try to promote ownership on the internet, you kind of expect a lot of these things that exist in the terms of service to exist. You'd expect there to be limits on some of these things. But you would also kind of expect that we've really solved this in the cryptocurrency world, that if you've got a wallet, you have like the complete and utter control over everything that is in that wallet, and nobody can take that away from you. That's right, but you kind of have to look at wallets from two angles. There's the wallet provider, the client you use, the UI that you use, the RPC provider you use. And then there's the protocol, the thing that you're interacting with under the hood. And those often differ. For example, a common wallet like MetaMask, you would think would have a lot of these things just like locked down in terms of you would be able to own all of these things. And to some degree, that's right? If you own the private key, MetaMask is not going to try and take the private key or take the contents of that private key. They do guarantee that. But they can terminate service for you at will. And service is access to their API. So they can essentially brick the client that you're using, your browser extension. They determine that your wallet address is doing something they don't like. They can cause their app to not work for you. And we actually saw this in the middle of the sanctions that happened on Tornado Cash, which is a privacy protocol that got sanctioned by the US government. The RPC provider, the servers that you use to connect to the Ethereum protocol, was run by Infura. That's the default if you use MetaMask. And the default Infura RPCs censored transactions that were going to Tornado Cash. They wouldn't actually process them. So even though it was signed and valid with your private key, the middleman you were using to get those to the protocol would not pass those through. And then transfer rights. I mean, I guess private keys are a really interesting case. If you're using a private key-based wallet on Ethereum, which I think at least seems to be still the default in wallets like MetaMask, they're bound to a private key. They're not transferable. If you have ever seen and held that private key, you will always have access to that private key. You'll always have access to the assets of the wallet. That's actually a superpower. That's a really good thing. That's not a bad thing at all. It's part of the thing that makes cryptocurrency really interesting, is that you can truly own that private key and nobody else can take that private key away from you. But it also means that they're not really transferable. They're not designed to be sent from one person to another. Sharing a private key with someone else doesn't give the person you're sending it to any guarantee that the assets in that wallet will still exist by the time they try to withdraw them. You, as the original owner, can always withdraw them. They're not designed to be transferable, but that's okay. They're not. That's by design. The nice thing about things like Ethereum is we have this escape hatch. If the client you're using, the application you're using, is not doing the things you would like it to do, you can always back out to doing things yourself and interacting directly with the protocol. That gives us a lot better access to all of these things. Enforcement is secured by validators, people running software that are all processing the rules of the network and coming to consensus together. I think this is where cryptocurrency protocols have actually done the most work, which is figuring out ways that we can come to consensus about what is true without having one centralized enforcer. And it is exclusive, right? Your authorization on your account, Ethereum has multiple types of accounts, both private key bound and non-private key bound in the form of smart accounts. That is your exclusive license. If you have authorization on that account, you can use that account, guaranteed by the protocol validators. You do have a perpetual ability to use it. It's as long as Ethereum is around. And so the question becomes, how long will Ethereum be around? How resilient is it? What about things like forks? If somebody decides to fork the network, as we've seen once in Ethereum's history, what happens then? The specter of a fork kind of looms now with all of the volume in different protocols and different stablecoins. If a fork occurs, what's valuable where? And to what degree are your accounts going to be usable in all of the forks versus just one of the fork? It's an open question, but by and large, as long as there's some fork of the protocol that runs forever, you'll have access to your things forever. There's also the quantum question, which Ethereum's doing a lot of stuff to try and address with some new protocol things. It's an open question, but at least there's work being done to get to a point where perpetual access is. And you do have pretty much full usage rights, right? You don't have a right to assets necessarily in the way that we think about them, owning the coins. What you have a right to is VM execution, that when you send a transaction asking it to execute some opcodes, it will execute those opcodes and execute the state changes associated with those opcodes according to the way the VM works. It doesn't always map one-to-one with how we think about sending tokens or trading tokens, right? There's things like MEV and slippage and all of these other things that can adjust the expected outcome. But you are guaranteed that the execution will happen exactly as the rules of the protocol work. That gets us to transfer rights. And to me, this is one of the most interesting things about ownership, is that even if we solve all of the other problems, there's still a question of, can you transfer your account to somebody else? You can transfer assets, no problem. I think cryptocurrencies have solved that really well. But can you transfer accounts? Can you have a big bundle of assets that all go in one place together? And even if you have smart accounts these days, smart contracts that hold things, there's still a little asterisk on transfer rights, which is the concept of an approval. An account can give approval to another account to spend its token balances, transfer its NFTs or transfer its tokens. And those approvals can stay active even across transfers of smart accounts. And so despite the fact that you can transfer authorization, right? You can send this account from one owner to another because it's a smart contract and you can update the owner. There's still this question of what happens to the active approvals? What happens to those things that are a little bit outside the norm of just an atomic transfer of like, I send it from point A to point B and everything, all the value associated with it goes in that one transaction. There's still an edge case. And to me, it kind of brings up a question of, is the idea of not your keys, not your coins, which has been one of those central ideas of crypto for a long time, is that enough to represent ownership of all of the things we want to own on the internet? Certainly it's enough to represent a lot of ownership. And certainly it's a meaningful upgrade to a lot of ownership structures that we have on the internet. Not your keys, not your coins. If our Twitter accounts and our bank accounts and our domain accounts all worked like this, it would be a meaningful upgrade to the internet. And so we've done a lot of work to get to a point where this is genuinely making the internet a better place, which is genuinely giving more access to ownership than would otherwise be available. But is this all there is to ownership? Is it just about having a key, owning something? Or to go back to the definition of ownership, are each of these parts of ownership variables to be adjusted? Not your keys, not your coins is a very opinionated version of this kind of ownership, right? Where protocol enforces exclusive perpetual usage rights and transfer rights subject to like some limitations involved in, if you have the key, it's yours. If you don't have the key, it's not. and keys aren't transferable. But what if we treated ownership on the internet as not just not your keys, not your coins, but as a series of variables we can play with? What if there's more to ownership than just owning something in an account? What if we can use each of these subcomponents of what it means to own something and play with it, create different types of ownerships on the internet, right? There's lots of different ways you can enforce rights, lots of different means by which execution can be enforced, right? We've done a lot of work to figure out how we can do decentralized consensus over VM execution. But are there other novel things that are a little bit less explored? What does it look like for multi-party compute to be a real core part of it, rather than just strict consensus? Key sharing and like splitting a key up into multiple parts. What does it look like if there's like a mix of protocol consensus and some kind of human or organizational intervention? I don't know whether one is better than the other, but to me, this is a design space. It's a series of decisions you can make to come up with an objective and an ultimately good outcome, which is more unique and more beneficial ways of owning things on the internet. And the same applies to all the rest of them. Who can claim these rights? What if ownership what can we do about mutual ownership on the internet? About gradiated ownership, so people own different amounts of different things, and that's carries through time. Should all ownership be perpetual? Is time-limited ownership okay? Are other forms of ownership that are not based on time, but are based on something else? The term is not time-bound. What does that look like? What does it look like for your usage rights to be, on one side of the spectrum, objectively guaranteed all the time, and the other side, subject to change over time, in a way that, instead of just being arbitrary and somebody else chooses that for you, works according to some set of rules that everybody agrees to ahead of time? What about transfer rights? Can we really get to a point where the transfer of an asset like an account that has all of these weird, dangling, kind of additional things attached to it, additional rights, additional responsibilities, additional things that could be valuable in the future, where all of those things go with it? So rather than just looking at the entirety of ownership on the internet as not your keys, not your coins, very objectively this and only this, or only determined by a central authority who can do whatever they want, what does that weird middle ground look like? What does it look like when we treat each of these as a variable and as part of systems design and a part of building things that can allow ownership structures on the internet to last for a very, very, very long time? That's it. I think it's a really interesting question of what does it mean to own things on the internet? I think I'll probably spend the rest of my career trying to figure out what it looks like. And it's a very wide open design space. And so I think you all should think about that. Thanks for having me.